My name is Iris Ashford and I am 31 years old. Software engineer. Founder of a small company. The kind of woman who shows up before the lights come on and stays long after they go dark. I look ordinary. I sound ordinary. But what I am about to tell you is the story I never told anyone for 22 years. When I was 9 years old, my own parents drove me 6 hours into the high desert of eastern Oregon and left me on a wooden porch with a cracked plastic suitcase and 47 cents in my pocket. They did not hug me. They did not cry. My mother would not even look at me through the back window of that Buick. And as the dust from their tires rose up and swallowed the road behind them, I heard her voice through the cracked glass say 7 words that I would carry inside my chest for the next 10 years. She was the one we could afford to lose. I was 9. 10 years later, those same 2 people walked into my grandfather's funeral wearing pressed black suits and rented grief. They talked about family. They talked about fairness. They talked about a $100 million estate they believed was rightfully theirs. They brought a lawyer. They brought a strategy. They brought the same smiles they had practiced in the mirror for 2 decades. What they did not bring was the truth. Because what none of them knew. What not even I fully understood until a lawyer named Marion Voss opened a sealed leather portfolio in front of a room full of witnesses. Was that my grandfather Henry Ashford had been quietly building something for 8 long years. A machine. A trap. A final design. And when that document was read out loud in his living room, my mother's face went from entitled to ashen in under 4 seconds, and her chair scraped backward against the hardwood floor like a scream she could not yet release. But I am getting ahead of myself. Because before the lawyer, before the inheritance, before the sentence that would end my mother forever, there was a porch. There was a suitcase. There was a 9-year-old girl who did not yet know she was being thrown away. Let me take you back to the day they left me behind. If you have ever been the child no one fought for. If you have ever loved someone who chose to stay when others chose to leave. Stay with me. Because the quietest people in the world are the ones holding the loudest endings. Welcome to a story about silence. About iron. About a man who never raised his voice. And a girl who learned that the people who walk away do not get to decide who you become. Drop a comment below before we begin. And subscribe. Because what happens in the 3rd hour of this story is something I have never been able to say out loud until today. It was August. I remember that because the air smelled like dried grass and hot fence wire, and my sneakers stuck to the vinyl of the back seat of my father's Buick. We had been driving for 6 hours from Portland, and no one had spoken to me since the gas station in Bend. My mother Diane sat in the front seat flipping through a magazine she was not reading. My father Glenn drove with one hand on the wheel, and the other tapping the armrest like a man counting down the minutes until he could be somewhere else. Somewhere without me. I did not know where we were going. They had not told me. I only knew that 2 nights before I had heard my mother on the phone in the kitchen saying the word arrangement. And the word temporary. And the word burden. And I had pretended I was asleep on the stairs, because at 9 years old you already know which words are about you. When we turned onto the gravel road that led to Ashford Stables, my mother finally turned around. But she did not look at my face. She looked past me. At the suitcase. You will have your own room, she said. Grandpa has a big house. That was it. That was the entire explanation. For leaving your 9-year-old daughter with a 70-year-old man she had met twice at Christmas. My father carried my suitcase to the porch the way a delivery driver drops off a package he is already late for. He did not kneel. He did not hug me. He set the suitcase down and walked back to the car without looking at me once. And my mother. My mother stayed in the passenger seat, with the engine running and the window cracked 2 inches. I stood on the bottom step of that porch, and I looked back at her. Just for a moment her eyes met mine. Half a second of contact. And then she leaned toward my father, and said something through the glass that I was never supposed to hear. But I heard it. She was the one we could afford to lose. The Buick backed out. Gravel popped under the tires. And the only sound left in the entire world was the slow groaning creak of an old windmill turning behind the barn. Turning the way it had been turning long before I arrived. Turning the way it would keep turning long after everyone forgot I existed. I stood there until the dust settled. I stood there until the car disappeared past the tree line. I stood there until the silence got so loud it started to hum. And then the screen door opened behind me. He was 6'1". White hair buzzed short like a soldier. A chambray work shirt with grease worked deep under his fingernails. Henry Ashford. My grandfather. A man who in 9 years had spoken maybe 200 words to me. He did not crouch down to my level. He did not ask if I was tired. He did not ask if I had eaten. He looked at the suitcase. He looked at me. And he said 5 words. Can you carry that yourself? I nodded. I could not trust my voice. Good. Your room is at the top of the stairs. Second door. Drop it off. Then meet me in the workshop. No hug. No cookie. No promise that everything would be okay. Just a direction. And a job. I dragged that suitcase up wooden stairs that creaked under my sneakers. I shoved it into a room that smelled like cedar and old wool blankets. And then, because I did not know what else to do, I walked back down. The workshop sat behind the main barn. A long concrete-floored room lined with pegboard walls. Every wrench hung in order of size. Every socket set labeled by hand in black marker. Everything had a place. And a reason. The smell hit me first. Saddle leather and machine oil. Laid so deep into the wood and the concrete that the building itself seemed to be made of work. I did not know it yet, but that smell would become the smell of safety. The smell of home. The smell of the only place on earth where I was not a burden. Henry was standing at a workbench holding a leather bridle with a broken buckle. He did not look up. He pointed at a stool beside him. Sit. I sat. Watch. I watched. He did not tell me my parents loved me. He did not tell me they would come back. He did not promise me anything. He just fixed the buckle. Slow. Precise. The way a surgeon stitches a wound. And when he was finished he handed me an oil rag, and he said one sentence. You will work. Working is how you stop drowning. That was my welcome to Ashford Stables. That was the entire orientation. That was the closest thing to a hug I would receive from him for almost 3 years. And somehow it was exactly what I needed. But I did not know yet who Henry Ashford really was. I did not know about the patents. I did not know about the land. I did not know about the iron ring on his right hand or the inscription hidden inside it. I did not know that the man who ate canned soup 3 nights a week and bought his clothes at the feed store was sitting on a fortune that would one day blow my mother's world apart. And I certainly did not know that 22 years later, in this exact same workshop, he would hand me a piece of metal and whisper 6 words that would change everything. We will get to that. But first you need to understand what he taught me. Because the lesson came before the inheritance. And the lesson is the only part that ever mattered. Henry taught me how to use a torque wrench before he taught me how to make scrambled eggs. That first week I learned to tighten a bolt to spec. Not too loose. Not stripped. Feel it catch, he said. That is where the metal wants to stop. Go past that. And you break the very thing you are trying to hold together. He spoke in sentences like that. Short. Plain. With a second meaning hiding behind the first one. He never pointed out the second meaning. You either caught it. Or you did not. By the second month, I was helping him repair fence posts and recalibrate the irrigation pump. By the third month, he let me use the welding torch. Supervised. Gloves and mask on. But real work. Real sparks. Real metal. He never spoke about my parents. Not once. If I brought them up, he would pause. Then redirect. Hand me the 3/8 socket. Go check the water trough in paddock 2. It was not cruelty. It was a decision. He was teaching me something I would not understand for years. He was teaching me that I could build an entire day without them in it. He was teaching me that a life is not something that is given to you. It is something you assemble. Piece by piece. Bolt by bolt. Working evening by working evening. And then one night I noticed the ring. We were in the workshop. He was sketching a modification for the barn ventilation system. Clean lines. Precise dimensions. The kind of drawing that belonged in an aerospace office. Not on a ranch. And as his pencil moved across the page, I saw it catch the light. A thick band of dull iron on his right hand. Not gold. Not silver. Iron. Worn smooth on the outside from decades of labor. With something etched into the inner surface that I could not quite read. What is that ring? I asked. He looked at it like he had forgotten it was there. My father's. What is it for? He turned it once around his finger. And he said 5 words I would not understand until I was 19 years old. Standing over his recliner. With my hand on his still warm wrist. Keeping. A promise. Then he picked up his pencil and went back to his drawing. And almost as an afterthought he added one more sentence. So quietly I almost missed it. You do not inherit a thing, Iris. You earn the right to keep it. I was 11 years old. I did not understand. I did not yet know what was etched inside that ring. I did not yet know what promise he was keeping. I did not yet know that one day, in a living room full of witnesses, that ring would become the single piece of evidence that destroyed my mother's last lie. But the seed had been planted. And Henry Ashford never planted anything he did not intend to harvest. I did not know what my grandfather was worth. To me he was a man who fixed things and went to bed at 9. A man who drove a 20-year-old Ford pickup. A man who bought his shirts at the feed store in town. A man who ate canned chicken noodle soup 3 nights a week because he said it was efficient. But Henry Ashford had been a mechanical engineer for 32 years before he retired to that ranch. He held 14 United States patents on industrial irrigation valve systems. Systems used by agricultural operations across 7 western states. The royalties alone were substantial. The kind of substantial that does not need to be spoken about. The ranch itself sat on 1,142 acres of high desert land. With water rights that dated back to the original homestead deed of 1923. Ashford stables boarded 37 horses. Mostly quarter horses. A few warm bloods. The operation barely broke even on training fees. But the land underneath it, combined with the patent portfolio, was worth a number that 9-year-old me would have refused to believe. And here is the part that haunts me still. The people who dumped me on that porch had always known it. Every single phone call my mother ever made to that ranch was about money. Was the insurance current? Were the property taxes paid? Did Henry need help managing his accounts? She never. Not one time. In 10 years. Asked me what grade I was in. She knew. Glenn knew. They had been circling that estate like vultures since before I was born. And the day they drove me out there, they were not abandoning a daughter. They were placing a chess piece. They were planting a stake in the ground. Because they believed. They truly believed. That when Henry died, the ranch would flow down through Diane, their only surviving child. What they did not count on was Henry. Watching. Listening. Calculating. For a decade. With the precision of a man who designed valve systems that never failed under pressure. What they did not count on was the iron ring on his right hand. And what they absolutely did not count on was me. The years passed the way they pass on a working ranch. In seasons. Not semesters. I learned to shoe a horse at 12. I rebuilt the south fence line at 13. At 14 Henry and I took apart the windmill behind the barn. The same windmill whose creak had been the last sound I heard the day my parents left. We rebuilt it from the base plate up. New bearings. New blades. Rebalanced rotor. Henry taught me how to calculate wind load. How to account for metal fatigue in the shaft housing. How to test pump action at different revolutions per minute. It took us 3 full weekends. When we finished. When the first gust of wind caught the new blades. That groaning creak I had known for 5 years was gone. Replaced by a smooth steady hum. I stood there. 14 years old. And I felt something move inside my chest that I did not have a word for. Henry did. That, he said, is the sound of something working the way it is supposed to. He did not look at me when he said it. But I felt the second meaning land. The way you feel a bolt catch at the exact correct torque. The workshop became my evenings. While other kids my age were on their phones. I was learning to read engineering schematics. To solder circuit boards. To write code on a second-hand laptop Henry bought me from a pawn shop in Burns. The smell of saddle leather and machine oil became the smell of who I was becoming. My parents called maybe 4 times a year. Christmas sometimes. My birthday if they remembered. The calls always followed the same pattern. My mother would ask Henry about insurance. About property taxes. About whether he had updated his will. My father would get on the line for 30 seconds and say something like, "You being good for your grandpa?" The kind of question that does not want an answer. And then, there was my 15th birthday. My mother called the week before. And for the first time, in 6 years, she made a promise. She gave me her word. That she, Glenn, and Brian, would drive out for the weekend. Brian, my older brother, 3 years older than me. The one they kept. I had not seen him since the day I was 9. I had spent 6 years wondering if he ever asked about me. I cleaned the guest room twice. I picked wildflowers from the back pasture and put them in a mason jar on the dresser. Henry did not say anything. But on Friday afternoon I caught him driving back from town with a white bakery box in the passenger seat. A cake. He had bought a cake. Which was the most he had ever done for any occasion in 5 years. Saturday came. No car on the gravel road. Sunday morning. No call. No text. No nothing. At 6 in the evening on the day after my birthday. My mother left a voicemail. Not a live call. A voicemail. Said Glenn's business meeting ran long. Said they would try for next month. They did not try for next month. I sat on the porch that night with a slice of grocery store cake on a paper plate. And I watched the sun go down behind the barn. I did not cry. I had stopped crying about my parents 2 years before. Henry came out and stood next to me. He did not say a word for what felt like a very long time. Then I heard him go back inside. And through the screen door. I heard something I had never heard before in 5 years of living with him. I heard Henry Ashford raise his voice on the telephone. Do not promise that girl something you will not deliver. You do this again. Do not call here. The line went silent. Then I heard the receiver click into its cradle. He came back out onto the porch. He sat down beside me. He did not say a word about the phone call. He looked out at the windmill. And he said one sentence so quietly I almost missed it under the wind. Some people are not parents. They are just biology that did not stick. That was the most he ever said about my mother. In 10 years. It was also the moment I stopped waiting for her. But what I did not know that night. What I could not possibly have known sitting there with a paper plate on my knee. Was that exactly 4 years and 3 months later. I would be standing in a hospital parking lot. With Henry's truck keys shaking in my hand. Listening to a doctor say the words I had been outrunning since my freshman year of college. We will get to that. But you need to understand first. How fast it happened. And how hard he tried to hide it. I graduated high school with a 3.9 grade point average and a full scholarship to Oregon State for mechanical engineering. Henry drove me to campus in the old Ford. He carried one of my bags into the cinder block dorm room. He set it inside the door. And he looked around the small space the way he looked at everything. Like he was running a structural assessment. Ceiling is fine. He said. Outlets are grounded. You will be all right. That was his version of a goodbye speech. We walked back to the truck. I hugged him. The first hug I had ever initiated in 9 years of living under his roof. And he was stiff with it. The way tall men sometimes are when they do not know where to put their arms. And then. He coughed. A deep wet cough that came from somewhere in his chest that I did not like the sound of. The kind of cough that has been hiding inside someone for longer than they want to admit. I pulled back. I looked at his face. Are you okay? Dust? He said. Ranch dust. Go learn something. He drove away. And I stood in that parking lot watching the old Ford get smaller on the highway. The last thing I saw before it crested the hill and disappeared was the faint glint of that iron ring on his right hand resting on the steering wheel. I told myself it was dust. I told myself it was dust for 2 months. By October I was calling every 3 days. His voice was getting thinner every week. By November I was calling every night. And one Wednesday in November he did not pick up. He did not pick up. I called 5 times. I called Dale the foreman. Dale found him in the workshop. On the floor. Conscious. But unable to stand. He had been there. Cold concrete under him. For 3 hours. I drove the 4.5 hours from Corvallis to Burns in 3 hours and 10 minutes. I do not remember the drive. I remember the parking lot of the small county hospital. I remember a doctor in a green sweater. I remember the way his hands stayed in his coat pockets when he spoke. The way doctors keep their hands in their pockets when they are about to give you a sentence you cannot return. Stage 4. He said. I did not hear the rest of the sentence. I heard the word stage. And I heard the word 4. And then the parking lot went very quiet. Even the wind seemed to stop. I came home that weekend and I did not leave. I dropped my fall term. I deferred my scholarship. I moved back into the room at the top of the stairs. Second door. The same room I had dragged a plastic suitcase into 10 years before. The ranch was still running. But it was running slower. Gates Henry would have fixed in a day were held shut with baling wire. The barn roof had a new leak. He had covered it with a blue top instead of replacing the flashing. And Henry himself had lost 20 pounds he did not have to spare. I did not ask his permission. I started catching up on the deferred maintenance the way I had been taught. Find the problem. Break it into parts. Solve each part. Test the whole. But every night, when I came inside from the workshop, Henry was in his recliner by the living room window. A little smaller than the night before. A little quieter. A little farther away. And one evening in early September, he looked up at me from that recliner. And he said 6 words that froze me in the doorway with a bowl of soup in my hands. Iris. There is something. You need to know. I know some of you watching right now are thinking about a person who raised you when they did not have to. Hold on to that thought. Because what Henry was about to tell me was the first thread of a plan he had been weaving in absolute silence for 8 years. If this story is reaching something inside you, comment one word. Who? Tell me about the person who showed up for you when no one else did. And please subscribe. Because the part that is coming next, the part where my mother walks back through that door, is the part you are not going to be ready for. I set the soup down on the side table beside his chair. I sat on the floor next to him. The way I used to sit on the stool in the workshop when I was 9. He reached over with a hand that had once been strong enough to bend rebar. And he patted the arm of his chair twice. Henry's version of a long embrace. Grandpa, I said, we need to talk about the ranch. No, we do not. He said, if something happens to me, it is handled. He said it the way he said everything. Flat. Final. Like a bolt talk to spec. Then he added one more sentence. There is a woman named Marion Voss. Attorney in Bend. When the time comes, she will contact you. Everything you need is with her. What does that mean? I asked. It means you do not have to worry about it. That is not an answer. I said. It is the answer you are getting. He patted my hand once. He coughed. A long shuddering one this time. And when he caught his breath he said one more thing. I set it up years ago, Iris. You will see how it works. Just trust the paperwork. I wanted to push. I wanted documents. Numbers. Schedules. A plan I could audit. That was the engineering brain he had built inside me. But something in his voice told me. This was one system he had already tested. And my job was to step back. And let it run. So I did. I sat there on the floor of the living room, listening to the irrigation pump cycle on and off in the distance. And I let it be enough. I did not know what was in that trust. I would not know for 2 more months. But I knew the man who built it. And that was enough to sleep on. It was a Thursday night in October when he told me about the ring. We were in the workshop. Him on the old wooden chair I had dragged in so he could sit while I finished rewiring the breaker panel. The smell of saddle leather and machine oil hanging in the air the way it always did. Thick. Warm. Like the room itself was breathing. He held up his right hand and turned the iron ring slowly under the work light. My father wore this ring for 41 years. He said. He was a machinist in Salem. Built parts for the sawmills. When he retired, he gave it to me. And he said one thing. Keep what matters. Let the rest go. He slid the ring off his finger. Held it up between thumb and forefinger. And for the first time in 10 years he gestured me closer. Read the inside. He said. I leaned in. The metal was warm from his skin. And there, etched in small block letters on the inner band, so small you had to know to look for it, were a date and 2 words. March 14th, 1962. Ashford Keeps. What does it mean? I whispered. It means what it says. He said. The Ashfords keep their word. They keep what they build. And they keep the people who show up. He held the ring up between us. It caught the light. Dull and heavy. When the time comes. He said. This goes to the person who earned it. Not the person who asks for it. He slid it back onto his finger. Then he picked up his pencil. And went back to sketching a ventilation modification for a barn he would never live to finish. I did not know it then. But that ring, worn smooth on the outside from 41 years of sawmill metal and 20 more years of ranch work, was about to become the most expensive piece of jewelry in the state of Oregon. Not because of what it was worth, but because of what it proved. 3 nights before he died, he called me into the living room. His voice was barely above a whisper by then. The cough had become a permanent resident in his chest. A low rolling thing that bent him at the waist when it hit hard. His skin was the color of paper. But his eyes were still sharp. Engineer sharp. Calculating something behind them I could not see. Come here, he said. I knelt by the recliner. He took my right hand, turned it palm up, and he slid the iron ring off his own finger, and pressed it into my palm. He closed my fingers around it, one by one, the way you teach a child to hold something fragile. It was still warm. Keep it, he said, where they can see. Who? I asked. Where who can see? He smiled. The first real smile I had seen on his face in weeks. You will know, he said, when they walk through that door. I did not understand. Who would walk through what door? He had not had a visitor in 2 months. The only people who came to the ranch were Dale and Pete and the vet. But he closed his eyes. And he said one more sentence. The last full sentence Henry Ashford would ever say to me. The paperwork already speaks Iris. Your only job is to wear it where they can see. I put the ring on my right thumb. It was too big for any finger. The inscription pressed cold against my skin. And I sat on the floor beside him until his breathing slowed. And then, until it slowed more. He died on a Tuesday in November. 2 days before the first snow. I was in the kitchen making coffee. And I heard something I cannot describe to you. Except to say, I heard the silence. Not the absence of noise. The absence of him. The cough that had been his constant companion for 6 months. Stopped. The whole house held its breath. I walked to the living room. And I found him exactly the way I knew I would find him. In his recliner. Eyes closed. Face calm. One hand resting on the arm of the chair. The other folded in his lap. Where the iron ring used to be. There was only the pale circle of skin where it had lived for 60 years. The window was open an inch. And through it came the creak of the windmill. Slow. Rhythmic. The same creak I had heard the day I arrived at 9 years old. Except now. It sounded like a door closing. I sat on the floor next to his chair for a very long time. I did not cry. Not because I was strong. But because Henry had spent 10 years teaching me that grief is something you carry. Not something you perform. I reached for the iron ring on my own thumb. And I turned it once. The way he used to. Keep it. Where they can see. I did not understand it yet. But I would. In less than 72 hours. The obituary ran on Thursday. By Friday morning, my mother called. I had not heard her voice in almost 2 years. The last time had been a voicemail asking Henry if his tax situation would allow for a small loan. She had not even addressed it to me. Now here she was. Voice pitched low and soft. The grief performance tone I would come to know very well over the next 48 hours. Iris. Sweetheart. We just heard about Daddy. Daddy. She called him Daddy when she wanted something. The rest of the time he was your grandfather. Or Henry. Or nothing at all. The funeral is Saturday. I said. We are coming. Of course we are coming. Glenn and Brian too. We would not miss it. She paused. I could hear my father in the background saying something about a flight. And then she added. So casually it almost slipped past me. Has anyone talked to you? About the estate? Yet? Not. Are you eating? Not. Do you need help with the arrangements? Not. How are you holding up? The man who raised you just died. The estate. 3 days after his death. Before his body was even in the ground. And my mother's first real question was about the money. There is an attorney. I said. Her name is Marion Voss. The silence on the other end of that line told me everything. She had not expected Henry to plan ahead. She had expected a confused old rancher with a handshake estate. She had expected a family who could argue its way to a split. She was wrong about all of it. But she did not know that yet. We will be there Saturday. She said. Her voice tightening. We should all sit down together. As a family. Family. That word. From her mouth. After 20 years of absence. It tasted like rust. Marion Voss drove out to the ranch on Friday morning. She was in her mid-50s. Grey-streaked hair pulled back. Wearing a barn jacket over a blouse. Like she had dressed for both a law office and a ranch visit on the same morning. She carried a leather portfolio. And a sealed envelope. We sat at the kitchen table. Henry retained me 8 years ago. She said. He was methodical about this. Everything is in order. She opened the portfolio. She showed me the basic structure. A trust. The details of which she said would be read formally after the funeral. In the presence of all relevant parties. She could not share specifics yet. Then she placed the envelope on the table between us. He asked me to give you this. Before the reading. He was very specific about the timing. The envelope was plain white. Sealed with masking tape. My name written on the front in Henry's blocky engineer's handwriting. The kind of handwriting that fits inside the grid of an engineering pad. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. The kind he tore from the yellow legal pads he used for sketching. 3 sentences. Stay calm. Let them talk. The paperwork already speaks. That was all. No explanation of the trust. No list of assets. No instructions on how to handle my parents. Just Henry. Distilled down to 3 lines. telling me the exact same thing he had been telling me since the night he handed me a wrench at 9 years old. The work is already done. Your job is to stand there and let it hold. I folded the letter. I put it in my jacket pocket, next to the warmth of my own skin and the weight of the iron ring on my thumb. Marion watched me with steady eyes. He knew they would come, she said quietly. He planned for it. I nodded. Of course he did. Henry Ashford built things that held up under pressure. He always had. They arrived Saturday morning at 10. I watched them from the kitchen window. A rented black SUV that looked like it cost more per day than my father used to make in a week. My mother stepped out first. Sunglasses on. Black silk dress. Heels entirely wrong for a ranch driveway. My father followed in a dark suit that did not quite fit. He had either lost weight or bought it cheap. And then Brian. My brother was 22 now. Tall. Sandy-haired. Wearing a wool peacoat. And the expression of a young man who had been told this trip would be short and profitable. I had not seen him since I was 9 years old. He looked like Glenn around the jaw. He looked like Diane around the eyes. He looked like a complete stranger. But here is what I want you to understand. Here is the part that hurt the most. They did not come to the door first. They walked the property for 20 straight minutes. My mother pointed at the barn, the pastures, the equipment shed. My father had his phone out, tapping, taking notes, or calculating, or both. Brian stood at the paddock fence and looked at the horses the way someone looks at a used car they are considering buying. They walked the perimeter of my grandfather's life, like buyers at an open house. 20 minutes of appraisal, before they ever knocked on the front door of the man who raised me. When I finally opened that door, my mother stepped forward and pulled me into a hug I did not return. The hug felt like cardboard, like a costume she had not worn in years. Oh, sweetheart, she whispered into my hair. Look at you. Over her shoulder I heard my father's phone buzz. He silenced it fast. But not fast enough. The caller ID flashed on his lock screen. Pacific Collections. A debt collector. And in that single second, standing in the doorway of the house Henry Ashford built with his own hands, I understood everything. Glenn Mercer had not come to Oregon to grieve. He had come because he was drowning. And my grandfather's estate looked like a life raft. They all had. They just had different names for it. That evening, after the neighbor's casserole had been picked at, and the small talk had run dry, my mother sat down across from me at the kitchen table. She folded her hands in front of her, pinned her shoulders back. It was her boardroom pose. I had seen it exactly once before. At a family dinner when I was 7 years old. When she was arguing with Henry about money. Iris, we need to talk about your grandfather's estate. There is a formal reading scheduled, I said. After the funeral. I understand that. But, as family, we should discuss expectations. Family. There it was again. That word from her mouth. Like rust on the back of my tongue. What expectations? I asked. She looked at Glenn. Glenn leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. This property, he said. The land. The horses. Whatever patents your grandfather held. We have done some research. It is substantial. How substantial? I asked. Though I already knew. North of 100 million. He said. He said it like he was reading a stock ticker. Your mother is Henry's only surviving child. He continued. We have a reasonable expectation of inheritance. My mother reached across the table. And she put her hand on mine. The first time her hand had touched mine in 9 years. Manicured nails. A new ring I did not recognize. Cubic zirconia trying to pass for diamond. Sweetheart. She said. We are your parents. Grandpa would want his family taken care of. All of us. Together. I looked at her hand. This was the hand that had not waved goodbye from the Buick. This was the hand that had held a magazine she was not reading. For 6 hours. While her 9-year-old daughter sat in the back seat. This was the hand that, according to a voicemail she did not know I had saved, had typed the words she was the one we could afford to lose into a text message to my father. The night before they drove me out here. I pulled my hand back slowly. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not match her temperature. I just said one sentence. You did not share me. I said. Why would you share this? The room dropped 10 degrees. Glenn's jaw tightened. My mother's hand stayed frozen in midair. Brian stared at the surface of the table. And nobody answered. That night, Brian found me in the workshop. I was not organizing tools because they needed organizing. I was organizing them because the smell of saddle leather and machine oil was the only thing in the world that could slow my heartbeat. And I needed calm. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking at the pegboard walls, the workbench, the labeled drawers, like he was visiting a museum exhibit of a life he had never lived. So this is where he spent all his time. He said. This is where we spent all our time. I corrected. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that almost cracked me open. They told me you were the difficult one. I did not look up from the wrench set I was sorting. Did they? Yeah. He said. Mom said you had behavioral issues. That grandpa offered to take you because you needed structure. He paused. But this place does not look like a punishment. I set down the socket wrench. I turned to face him. Up close. Brian looked tired. Not road tired. Life tired. The kind of tired you get from growing up in a house where the money was always almost gone. And the stories kept changing. And for 1 second. 1 single second. I saw something flicker in his face that looked like doubt. Like the version of me he had been told about for 13 years did not match the woman standing in a workshop full of precision tools and labeled drawers. It was the closest thing to an honest moment we had ever shared. And then. It passed. He straightened up. He cleared his throat. And the math of his parents' desperation moved back into his eyes. Look. He said. I just want to make sure the reading is fair. Mom and Dad have been through a lot. Dad's business went under. We lost the house in Portland. They need this. They need this. I repeated. Yeah. He said. He walked out of the workshop. And the doubt was gone. Replaced by a number. By a calculation. By the same hunger I had seen in my mother's eyes across the kitchen table. I stood there in the doorway, watching his back disappear toward the main house. And I realized something that I had spent 20 years refusing to look at directly. I had not lost a brother on that August day when I was 9. I had never had one. The funeral was Sunday morning. At the small white clapboard church in town. The steeple that Henry had helped re-roof 12 years before. The pews were full. Ranch hands in clean jeans and pressed shirts. The hardware store owner. The vet. The county clerk. The woman from the feed store. Half the town came. Because Henry Ashford had been the kind of man who showed up for other people. And other people remembered. My mother sat in the front row. Positioned like the principal at a board meeting. Black silk. A practiced expression of sorrow. Lower lip trembling just enough to be visible from the third row. Tissue clutched in one hand. The other resting on Glenn's arm. Glenn stared straight ahead. Doing math in his head. Brian sat at the end of the pew. Checking his phone under his thigh. I sat across the aisle. With Marion Voss. And Dale and Pete. The two ranch hands who had worked beside Henry for more than a decade. The pastor spoke about Henry's quiet faith. His commitment to the land. His generosity. And then he opened the floor. My mother stood up. She walked to the front of the church. Tissue in hand. And she delivered a 3-minute eulogy about a father she had not visited in 15 years. She talked about his gentle wisdom. She talked about family bonds that distance could not break. She talked about how much she had sacrificed being apart from him. The ranch hands in the back row exchanged a look. I caught it from the corner of my eye. Dale leaned over to Pete and whispered something. I did not need to hear it. Everyone in that church knew who had actually been there and who had not. After the service, in the fellowship hall, I watched her work the room. She moved from group to group, touching arms, lowering her voice, leaning in close. I could not hear the words, but I could read the body language. She was planting something. I found out what it was 20 minutes later when Mrs. Harmon, the postmaster's wife, approached me with a careful expression on her face. Iris, honey, she said. Your mother mentioned that Henry's mind was not quite right toward the end. She said you were handling all his finances. I was not handling his finances. I said. He had an attorney for that. Oh? Mrs. Harmon trailed off. Embarrassed. And I understood. Standing there in that church basement with a paper plate of finger sandwiches in my hand. I understood exactly what my mother was building. She was constructing a narrative. Not for the courtroom yet. Not even for the lawyer. For the court of public opinion. For the witnesses, who would inevitably be deposed if she chose to challenge the trust. Confused old man. Vulnerable. Isolated on a ranch with a granddaughter, who handled everything. The word she wanted people to think. But would not say out loud. Undue influence. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The woman who had abandoned her father for 2 decades. Was now painting herself as the concerned daughter worried about his cognitive decline. But the people she was telling this to. The people who had actually been there. Who had watched Henry sharpen his own tools and balance his own books, and argue water rights policy at town council meetings until 6 months before he died. They were not buying it. She just did not know it yet. Glenn cornered me in the church parking lot afterward. He had loosened his tie. He had the look of a man who had been rehearsing a speech in his head all morning. We have retained legal counsel, he said. Just to make sure the process is transparent. What process? I asked. The estate distribution. The reading of whatever document your grandfather left behind. He said. Whatever document. Like it was a napkin note. Not a decade of deliberate legal architecture. We have concerns. He continued. About capacity. About influence. Henry was elderly. He was isolated. You were his sole caretaker for the last year. Any attorney would flag that. I looked at him. This was my father. The man who had carried my suitcase to the porch and driven away without looking back. Now standing in a church parking lot. Using words like capacity and influence to describe the man who had raised his daughter. You are going to argue that Grandpa was confused. I said. We are going to argue that the process should be fair. He corrected. And if it is not, we will challenge it. He had memorized that line from a website. I could tell by the rhythm. File whatever you want. I said. The reading is Monday morning. We will be bringing our attorney. He said. Bring whoever you want. I said. I turned. I walked to my truck. My hands were steady. My voice had been even. But inside my chest. Inside the engineer's brain Henry had built. I was running the numbers. Calculating loads. Testing for points of failure. Looking for the place where the structure might crack. If they were going to file. I needed to know the foundation was solid. I already believed it was. Monday morning would prove it. Right here. Right now. Is where most people would have screamed. I did not. My grandfather taught me. The quiet ones win on paper. If you have ever wished you had stayed calm. And let the truth land on its own. You are going to want to see exactly what Marion Voss pulled out of that leather portfolio next. Drop a comment if you are Team Iris. Hit the like button and subscribe right now. Because Monday morning is in the next sentence. And I promise you, you have never seen anything like what happens in that living room. Sunday night. I sat alone on the porch with Henry's letter unfolded on my knee. The paper was already soft at the creases from handling. Stay calm. Let them talk. The paperwork already speaks. 3 sentences. The man had reduced an entire estate strategy into 3 sentences. Because that is how engineers think. Strip it down to what carries the load. Discard the rest. The iron ring was on my thumb. Warm from my skin. I turned it once. Felt the inscription press against my finger. March 14th. 1962. Ashford Keeps. I thought about what he had said the night he pressed it into my palm. Keep it. Where they can see. And finally. Sitting on that porch. With the windmill turning slow in the November wind. I understood. It was not about display. It was about identification. About standing in a room. And being instantly recognizable. As the person who had stayed. Who had worked. Who had earned it. Without saying a single word. Henry had not given me a ring. He had given me evidence. A receipt. Proof of delivery. The kind an engineer would design. I folded the letter. I put it in my jacket pocket. I went inside. The windmill kept turning. The ring stayed on. Monday was coming. Monday morning. 9 o'clock. The reading took place in the living room of the ranch house. Henry had chosen that location himself. Marion told me he had specified it in writing. He did not want a sterile law office. He wanted it here. Inside the walls he had built. With the windmill turning outside the window. She had arranged 6 chairs in a semicircle facing a small table, where she sat, with the leather portfolio, and a notarized document. I arrived first. I took the chair closest to the window. Dale and Pete came next. Henry had named them as witnesses to the reading. Specified in writing. Then Frank Bolio, Henry's oldest friend. A retired large animal vet who had known him for 40 years. He shook my hand. Sat down. Did not say a word. At 9:15 exactly. The front door opened. My mother entered first. Charcoal suit. Composed entitlement. Glenn followed. Adjusting his cuffs. Behind them came a man I did not recognize. Mid-40s. Sharp suit. Leather briefcase. Their attorney. Brian came last. Hands in his pockets. Looking like he would rather be anywhere on earth than in that room. They took their seats. The room was silent. Except for the ticking of the mantel clock. And, if you listened closely, the faint creak of the windmill outside. Marion Voss looked around the room, confirming everyone was present. Thank you for being here, she said. This is the formal reading of the Henry Ashford Revocable Living Trust, which upon Mr. Ashford's death has become irrevocable under Oregon law. I will read the relevant provisions in full. I ask that all questions be held until the end. Glenn's attorney opened his briefcase. Took out a yellow legal pad. Glenn sat forward. My mother folded her hands in her lap. The boardroom pose. And Marion opened the document. She read slowly. Clearly. The way you read something that was built to be heard. The Henry Ashford Revocable Living Trust. Dated January 12, 2006. Amended July 2013. Hereby irrevocable upon the death of the settler. Provides as follows. She started with the preamble. Standard language. Formation under Oregon Revised Statutes. Trustee designations. Then she paused. Just for a single breath. Long enough that everyone in the room leaned forward an inch. And she got to the distributions. All trust assets. Including but not limited to. The real property known as Ashford Stables. Comprising 1,142 acres in Harney County, Oregon. She paused again. All water rights appurtenant thereto. She turned a page. All personal property located thereon. She let the silence stretch. And the full portfolio of 14 United States patents held by the settler. Together valued at approximately $104 million. The breath left my mother's body. I could hear it from across the room. Glenn went perfectly still. Brian sat back in his chair. Marion continued. Are distributed solely and irrevocably to the following beneficiary. She lifted her eyes from the page. She looked across the room. Directly at me. Iris. May. Ashford. The room did not move. I felt every pair of eyes land on me. Glenn's head turned. My mother's mouth opened. Brian sat back in his chair like he had been physically shoved. But Marion was not finished. The settler further directs. She continued. Her voice never wavering. That the following individuals are intentionally excluded from any distribution under this trust. And that this exclusion is not an oversight, but a deliberate decision made with full knowledge and sound judgment. She read the names. Diane Marie Mercer. Born Ashford. Glenn Robert Mercer. Brian Allen Mercer. Then she read the stated reasons. 1 sentence per person. Drafted in Henry's dry, precise, engineer's language. For Diane. My daughter Diane abandoned her minor child in my care in August 2007. And made no meaningful effort to parent, visit, or support said child in the years following. My mother made a sound. A small sharp sound, Like a piece of glass cracking. For Glenn. Glenn Mercer participated in and facilitated the abandonment described above. Glenn's hand gripped the arm of his chair until his knuckles turned white. For Brian. Henry had been gentler. Brian Mercer bears no personal fault, but was not raised in connection with this property or its values, and is provided for separately below. My mother's face was the color of paper. Glenn had stopped breathing. Their attorney's pen had stopped moving on the legal pad. But Marion was not finished. The trust further contains the following provisions. She said. First, a no contest clause under Oregon law. Any beneficiary or excluded party who contests the validity of this trust by any legal means forfeits any right to the token distributions described in Schedule B. She looked up. Schedule B provides a one-time payment of $5,000 to each excluded party, contingent on non-contest. A challenge eliminates even that amount. Glenn's attorney slowly put down his pen. He knew what that meant. A no-contest clause was not just a warning. It was a wall. Contest. And lose. And you walk away with absolutely nothing. But what came next was the architecture. The part Henry had spent 8 years building. Second, Marion said, the settler's testamentary capacity is attested by the following. 1. A cognitive evaluation performed by Dr. Rebecca Stahl, licensed psychiatrist. Dated January 2006. At the time of trust formation. 2. A second cognitive evaluation by Dr. Stahl. Dated April 2013. 18 months prior to death. 3. Witnessed attestations by 2 independent attorneys. Thomas Brandt of Portland and Carol Kimura of Eugene. Both present at the signing. And both present at the amendment. She let it settle. 3 independent professionals. 2 cognitive evaluations spread across 7 years. 2 outside attorneys with no stake in the outcome. Any argument that Henry Ashford had been confused, coerced, manipulated, influenced, would have to survive a wall of documentation that he had been quietly stacking, year by year, like sandbags before a flood, since before his granddaughter ever left for college. Glenn's diminished capacity argument, the one he had rehearsed from a legal website in a parking lot the day before, was dead on contact. My mother's undue influence narrative, the one she had whispered into Mrs. Harmon's ear at the funeral, was dead on contact. They had come into that living room with assumptions, with entitlement, with a hired attorney and a memorized vocabulary. And they had walked directly into 8 years of meticulous planning by a man who designed irrigation systems that were still running 40 years after he installed them. The color had not returned to my mother's face. Glenn was staring at the floorboards. Their attorney was very quiet. The silence in that room lasted exactly 8 seconds. I counted. And then my mother stood up. Her chair scraped backward against the hardwood floor. A sharp, ugly sound in the quiet room. And her composure cracked open. The way a dam gives way. All at once. With nothing left to hold it back. This is insane, she said. Her voice was high and thin. The performance tone gone. This was the real Diane. Stripped down to bone. He cannot do this, she said. He cannot leave everything. $100 million. To her. She pointed at me across the room. She was a child when she came here. She spat. She was nothing. We gave her to him because we did not have a choice. You had a choice. Dale said. He said it quietly. From his chair near the wall. The way ranch people say things that are not up for debate. My mother ignored him. She whipped around to face her attorney. Do something. She hissed. Object. File something. The attorney looked at her with the expression of a man who had just realized his retainer was not going to cover a fraction of what was coming. Mrs. Mercer. He said carefully. The documentation is extensive. A contest on capacity grounds would be extremely difficult to sustain. Given the evaluations. And the witness attestations. And the no contest clause. Then find something else. She was shaking now. Glenn reached for her arm. She yanked it away. Brian was staring at the surface of the table. And then. It came. The sentence that had been living inside my mother's chest for 10 full years. The truth she had papered over with silence. And distance. And the occasional phone call about money. She turned to face me. Her eyes wet. Her jaw tight. And she said it. Out loud. In front of every single person in that room. The same words I had heard through a cracked car window when I was 9 years old. Now spoken again. 10 years later. With witnesses. You were the one we could afford to lose. The room went still. Not quiet. Still. Dale closed his eyes. Pete looked at the floor. Frank Bolio, Henry's oldest friend, shook his head slowly. Marion did not move. And I sat in my chair by the window. The iron ring warm on my thumb. The November light slanting through the glass behind me. And I felt the weight of a sentence I had first heard through a car window when I was 9 years old. Now spoken again. A decade later. In the living room of the man who had taken me in. By the woman who had thrown me away. In front of witnesses who would never, ever, forget it. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I did not even take a deep breath. I sat in the chair Henry had placed by the window of the house he had built with his own 2 hands. I looked at my mother across the room. And I gave her the only answer she was ever going to get from me. 6 words. He already said no. In writing. The room exhaled. Marion nodded. A small, professional nod. And turned to the next page. There is one additional personal provision. She said. That I am directed to read. She looked down at the document. And began. To my granddaughter Iris. To whom I gave my father's ring. On the night of November 11th. I felt the ring on my thumb get heavier. This ring. Marion read. Bearing the inscription Ashford Keeps. And the date March 14th, 1962. Is both a personal inheritance. And a confirmation of intent. I gave it to Iris. Because she is the person who stayed. Who worked. And who earned the right to carry this name. Let the presence of this ring. On her hand. Stand as testament. That my wishes were communicated directly. Personally. And without coercion. I was of sound mind. I was not influenced. I was proud. Marion looked up from the page. Every head in that room turned. And every eye in that room landed on my right hand. Resting on the arm of the chair. with the iron ring catching the light from the window behind me. March 14, 1962. Ashford Keeps. And in that single second, I understood every word he had ever spoken to me. Keep it where they can see. It was not a display. It was a receipt. Proof of delivery. Engineer style. Documented. Witnessed. Specific. Henry had not just left me a ranch. He had left me a defense. He had built, with his own hands, from beyond the grave, the single piece of physical evidence that would make any undue influence claim collapse in court before it ever made it to a judge. Because how do you argue that a man was confused when he handed his only working heir, in front of a notarized affidavit, the literal inscribed iron ring of his own dead father? You cannot. It is over. Before it ever begins. Glenn's head was down. His attorney was packing his briefcase. Brian had not moved. Had not spoken. He was staring at the ring on my hand, with an expression I could not read. Maybe anger. Maybe shame. Maybe the slow, dawning understanding that the parents who had kept him had been lying to him about everything for 22 years. My mother stood frozen by her chair, tissue crumpled into a tight ball in her fist. The tears on her face no longer performed. She had said the quiet part out loud. The room had heard it. And no amount of revision, no future apology, no new story, was ever going to take it back. Henry Ashford, from beyond the grave, had built his final machine. And it worked. Exactly the way he designed it. The reading ended at 9:52. Marion closed the portfolio, thanked the witnesses, offered to answer any individual questions by appointment. The formal part of my mother's 20-year plan was over. In under 1 hour. Glenn's attorney was the first one to walk out. He shook Glenn's hand at the door, said something about reviewing options, and walked to his car at a pace that suggested he already knew there were no options worth reviewing. A contest would trigger the no contest clause, vaporizing even the $5,000 token gift. A capacity challenge would slam directly into 2 psychiatric evaluations and 2 independent attorney attestations. An undue influence claim would require proving that I, a college student, who had been living 3 hours away, had somehow controlled a man whose own doctor had certified his sharp cognitive function 18 months prior to his death, whose ring inscription was a literal documentary inheritance. There was no angle. Henry had sealed every single seam. Glenn followed the attorney out without looking at me. My mother lingered. She stood in the center of the living room, clutching her purse, her eyes moving across the walls, the windows, the mantel where Henry's engineering awards still sat in their wooden frames. She was looking at the house, the way she had looked at the property on Saturday, like a buyer who had just been told the sale was off. "This is not over," she said, to no one in particular. But it was. She knew it. I knew it. Every single person in that room knew it. She walked out. Brian was last. He stopped in the doorway. He turned. And he looked back at me. One long, unreadable look. And for one heartbeat, I thought he might say something. Anything. He did not. He put his hands back in his pockets. He followed his parents to the rented SUV. The engine started. The gravel crunched. And the car disappeared down the same gravel road it had arrived on. The same gravel road. The Buick had taken 10 years before. I stayed in my chair. The ring was warm. The windmill turned outside the window. The house was finally quiet. They never filed. Glenn's attorney sent a single letter to Marion Voss 2 weeks after the reading. A half-hearted inquiry about mediation. Marion responded with a 3-line summary of the no contest clause. And a polite invitation to proceed through the courts, if they wished. The letter was never answered. The $5,000 token payments sat uncollected for the full statutory period, and then reverted back into the trust. I do not know what happened to my father's debts. I do not know if my mother ever told the truth to a single person she whispered to at that funeral. I do not know what Brian believed by the time he got back to Portland. Whether he held onto the story his parents had told him for 13 years. Or whether the version of me he had seen in that workshop. The labeled drawers. The precision tools. The woman who did not match the description. Had planted something he could not dislodge. He never reached out. None of them did. I did not sell the ranch. Henry had not asked me to. And even if he had, I would not have. Ashford stables kept running. Dale and Pete stayed on. I hired 2 more hands. A part-time vet for the growing boarding operation. I finished my engineering degree remotely from the workshop, where Henry had taught me to solder a circuit board at 13. I launched my company from that same workbench. I filed 3 more patents in the first 2 years. But the thing I am proudest of is not the company. 18 months after the reading, I established the Henry Ashford Hope Foundation. Henry's Hope. For short. It provides trade apprenticeships, housing support, and mentorship for young people aging out of the foster care system. The ranch hosts a summer program every July. 8 kids. 6 weeks. Hands-on work with horses. Welding. Drafting. Basic engineering. The same curriculum Henry gave me. Minus the abandonment. The workshop still smells like saddle leather and machine oil. The windmill still turns. And every single kid who walks through the door of that barn on the first day gets the same first instruction I got 22 years ago. From a man who never raised his voice. Not a speech about resilience. Not a pamphlet on self-esteem. A wrench. A stool. And a sentence I now say in my own voice. You will work. Working is how you stop drowning. I am 31 years old now. I still wear the iron ring on my right thumb. The inscription has worn a little smoother over the years from my own skin. But you can still read it. If you know where to look. March 14th. 1962. Ashford Keeps. Sometimes. Late at night. When the wind comes down off the mountains and the windmill catches it just right. I sit on the porch where my parents left me with a plastic suitcase when I was 9 years old. And I listen to the slow steady hum of something working exactly the way it is supposed to. And I think about a man who never said the word love out loud. Not to me. Not in 10 years. But who said it? In every single bolt talked to spec. In every single fence line rehung. In every single evaluation he scheduled. In every single attorney he hired. In every single sentence of every single document. In an iron ring pressed into the palm of a dying man's hand. In a letter that contained only 3 sentences. Because 3 sentences were all he needed. My parents thought love was a transaction. My grandfather knew love was a structure. You build it. You test it. You document it. You make sure it holds. Long after you are gone. I was the one they could afford to lose. But I was also the one he chose to keep. And in the end, that is the only inheritance that ever mattered. If you made it this far, I want you to do 3 things for me. Right now. Before you close this video. The first one. If there is a person who raised you when they did not have to. A grandfather. A grandmother. An aunt. A neighbor. A coach. A stranger who became your family. Pause this video. Pick up your phone. And tell them today. Not tomorrow. Not someday. Today. Because my grandfather died on a Tuesday in November. And I never got to tell him what he was to me. While he could still hear it. Do not make my mistake. Tell them now. The second one. If this story reached something inside you. If you felt the weight of that porch. The dust of that gravel road. The warmth of that iron ring. Hit the like button right now. It costs you nothing. And it tells the algorithm to bring this story to one more person who needs to hear it tonight. Maybe a 9-year-old. Maybe a 31-year-old. Maybe someone who has been waiting for permission to stop apologizing for being kept by the right person. Instead of loved by the wrong ones. The third one. Subscribe. And turn on the bell. Because there are more stories like this one. Stories I have been carrying for years. Stories about quiet people who walked into loud rooms. And let the truth speak for them. If you stay with me. I promise. The next one will find you. Right when you need it most. And in the comments below. Type one word for me. Who? Tell me who showed up for you. When the people who were supposed to did not. I read every single one. Because somewhere out there. Tonight. There is a kid on a porch with a suitcase. Watching headlights disappear down a gravel road. And the only thing standing between that kid and the rest of their life is someone like Henry Ashford. Walking out through a screen door. And saying, can you carry that yourself? You can. You always could. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying. I will see you in the next one.